I think where I want to start with you guys is I assume that a lot of people know what a nonprofit is or are sort of familiar with, the nonprofit sector at large. But maybe let's just start by with a definition. So what is an NGO and how ubiquitous are they right now? Maybe Melissa, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So like you said, I think there is kind of a degree of common sense with a nonprofit. It's defined by a different funding structure to perpetuate their organization. So if you think of a typical for-profit corporation, they're expected to take an investment, make a product, earn a profit, and then continue to persist off of reinvesting their own profits from what they make. In contrast, a nonprofit is not necessarily expected to exist by continuing to sell its own good. Nonprofits, in theory, are supposed to be based off of providing a social good that's not necessarily expected to generate a profit for many reasons. I think most commonly because they're fulfilling a social need that is inherently unprofitable and so therefore unattractive for corporations to come in and provide a good or service in that field. So nonprofits are persisting off of a funding structure that depends on a combination of philanthropic donations from primarily the middle class and the wealthy, from government funding, and then increasingly under neoliberalism from these kind of market-like mechanisms that mimic what for-profit corporations do in selling a good and then depending on consumers to purchase that good. But ultimately in a slightly different relationship, because there's still no expectation that ultimately a nonprofit will be able to completely support itself by selling its own services and goods.
Mm-hmm. And just a small addition to that, we offer some data in the article illustrating the huge growth in nonprofit and foundation assets, as well as just the proliferation of third sector entities more generally. But it's a huge part of the economy. It's like 5 to 6% of GDP, and it employs about 10% of the American workforce. So it's a pretty big sector.
Right. I have one of the figures from the piece on the index of state and local government employment and public welfare versus the private organizations, and kind of how that's split off beginning, at least from this data, like it looks like the beginning of the 70s. So I guess the question then is like, how did we get here? What are the historic factors that led to the rise of the nonprofit sector? And then why did like the unique structure of the American welfare state lead to this boom in NGOs?
Yeah, just quickly about that graph that you just showed. I didn't realize it at the time when we published it, but that ended in 1995. And I assume 1996, that's welfare reform, that split grows even more dramatic. But to answer the question about the history, overall, the story that we tell in the article fits into, a story that I think is pretty well known to Jacobin readers, which is about the decline of working class associational capacity beginning around the 60s. And, today the workforce is pretty poorly unionized. I think it's 10%, and that's buoyed by public sector unionization. And not so long ago, a third of the American workforce was unionized, and those unions used to be major forces in fighting inequality and in fighting for social justice more generally. Also not to be forgotten are the sort of large mass membership organizations like the American Legion, Freemasons, Elks. These were far from progressive organizations by any means, but they were actual membership organizations, and they were responsive to the will of their members, and they did political work, and they influenced our politics. And then around the beginning of the 60s, you see these organizations start to decline in size, but more importantly in power. And I think nonprofits really step into that space. They step in where unions and mass membership organizations used to be. And that has dire consequences for our politics. The sort of advocacy nonprofits that have taken the place of the old associations, they are markedly more hierarchical, they're more top-down, they tend to be dominated by professional class staffers, and they really only interact with their memberships insofar as they're like a mailing list. There's very little democratic debate within these nonprofits, and it's much more staff-driven. And because it's staff-driven, it's also funder-driven. And so you just see a lot of the nonprofits are really insulated from the people that they supposedly represent.
So I guess to continue from that, the time period that you're talking about where we kind of see the start of the rise of the nonprofits is also the time period when you have kind of this college educated, white collar, I guess, professional managerial class workforce sort of starting to rise as well. Are the two connected in any way, or is that just a coincidence?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a connection there. I wouldn't say that NGOs are themselves, or the third sector is responsible by itself for the professional middle class takeover of the left and of political advocacy. But I think without a doubt, as the professional middle class is gaining political power, they're using NGOs as vehicles to perpetuate their agenda. And these are institutions that are controlled and run by the professional middle class. And I think, in this instance, the war on poverty is really instructive, because what you see in the 60s with the war on poverty is that, Johnson declares that we need these really ambitious initiatives. We need to go into impoverished communities and figure out how to root out this systemic issue. And the vehicles that ultimately the war on poverty legislation, the Economic Opportunity Act, relies on are NGOs, which are run by professional middle class staff.
Right. And so just for clarification, I suppose, because as Ben also mentioned, this is also from the piece. This is union membership in millions as a percentage of the labor force, and you can clearly see union membership has dipped so far. It's actually now, it was at its height a little over 30%. Now it's, this is in 2006 actually, so it's lower than 12%. But it would be, for clarification, it would be too strong of an argument to say that the NGOs caused the collapse of the labor movement and of unions generally, right? That it's not that this was the cause. It was more of, there was other reasons why the labor movement collapses, and then this kind of swoops in. It's as capitalism is transforming and you do get all these middle class people, this is where a lot of them end up. Is that fair? Or
I think that that's right. I mean, there can be a tendency to overemphasize the role of NGOs and, I guess, the professional managerial class more generally. And I mean, on the issue of just how intentional this was on the part of professional class interests, I guess I would emphasize more the structure of nonprofits than the particular people running them. So, you could have professional class staffers in mass membership organizations like unions or the American Legion or whatever. And if they are responsive to the will of the membership, then even if they bring their own set of biases and interests to the organization, they're going to be forced to represent interests that are not their own. And that, I think, is a dynamic that we ought to encourage. In the case of nonprofit advocacy organizations, again, oftentimes these nonprofits will have huge mailing lists, and they will call those mailing lists their membership, but they won't really have much interaction with their supposed members beyond that. And as a result, because they aren't actually interacting with the people that they supposedly represent, they're just insulated from the concerns of everyday people. And they're much more influenced by their funders. So I would stress that it's more of it's less professional class machination than it is just sort of the insulation within nonprofits.
So let's talk about that kind of structural bind that nonprofits or like the third sector more generally is in. Can you lay out why the kind of third sector approach to solving social problems can never sufficiently challenge capital? And then following from that, you guys have a term in your article, NGOism. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I'll start by addressing the question of structural constraints. So what we try to emphasize is that the structural constraints in NGOs, rather than being derived from the state, from the tax structure that NGOs are organized under, most people, when they hear NGOs, think of the 501c3 tax exempt status. Rather, what provides those structural constraints is the source of funding that NGOs rely on in order to continue to exist. And I think the biggest surprise for us as we dug more into the funding was to realize that actually the government is the far and away the biggest funder of nonprofit activity. And part of this is a historical story about the fact that NGOs start to rise as neoliberalism is instituted and the social welfare state in America starts to devolve and become more privatized. But NGOs are extremely reliant on state funding and basically could not persist as a sector without government funding. And that comes with a number of different constraints. First of all, it means that they're susceptible to all of the same forces that are tearing down the social welfare state under neoliberalism. So NGOs are forced to compete for social welfare funds to continue their services that become more and more scarce, forcing them into a more and more competitive environment where they have to, compete with other NGOs in order to secure government funding that's crucial for their survival. And then the further, I think probably the more, not interesting, but the thing that really ultimately makes nonprofits subject to the whims of the profit motive and to capital is the fact that government funding is really only given to provide social welfare services. So it's not really given to engage in political advocacy. And if nonprofits do want to engage in political advocacy, they have to go to the private sector to obtain that funding. And that can come from a number of sources. That can come from aggregated individual donations, that can come from major foundations, that can come from corporations. But what it means is that ultimately their ability to have any kind of political agenda and to perform any kind of political advocacy is dependent on private funding. And the largest sources of private funding come from the wealthiest people in society who don't want to have anything happen that will at all threaten their ability to accumulate and to make a profit. And so it puts nonprofits in this position where they're competing for these increasingly scarce funds, and then they're politically completely handicapped from actually engaging in any advocacy that would shore up their own financial security. So they're put in this really, there's no way out of this situation because governments will not, as a result of some of the reforms that we talk about, governments will not fund nonprofits to change the government.
Right. So I think the best way to sort of envision what nonprofit sector is that it carries out the functions of what the government ought to provide, right? But with less funding and in such a way that nonprofits are forced to be entrepreneurial, which in other words means that they're dependent upon private interests. So it's a form of executing what ought to be government function, but in such a way that private interests can sort of dictate the terms.
Right. So there are people that are in these organizations, obviously, who have really good intentions that a lot of people probably get into this work because they actually do care about public bads, that they want better outcomes for social problems. And then they just they're unable to because of the structure of what they're in. It seems like if only we had somewhere to put them in the state where they could effectively do that work. That maybe the people are there clearly. If only we had the right build out of, I don't know, maybe the welfare state. And
I have an idea.
Well, what's interesting too is that when you look at the New Deal, many of the New Deal programs explicitly mandated that funds had to go to other public institutions, and primarily, for a combination of reasons. Some would say because the federal government was too weak at the time, but most of those funds wound up going to the states. But that was actually how we built up any kind of state capacity to administer social programs. And I think this is why the 60s is such a watershed decade, because it just opens the floodgates to, instead of funding and building public institutions, to giving this money essentially to private actors. And that dynamic just continues to perpetuate itself because that agenda is compatible with both liberal ideas about the welfare state and very conservative ideas about the welfare state. Particularly conservatives' concerns that the big government setting universal standards would somehow not be sensitive to local concerns and instead create people who are dependent on the welfare state. And I think that's what's tricky about NGOs is that, everyone likes them.
And I think at this point, it's beyond just an agenda. I mean, on both sides of the aisle, there are just material interests at work. There are a lot of these private and public-private hybrid organizations that are wanting to get their beaks wet on any government spending. And, if you imagine the government as like a dying, suffering animal, then you've got all these parasites on it, and anytime you inject cash into it, all the parasites are just going to suck it up. And so right now, I mean, part of the problem is that we're spending a lot of money, which is great. It's a nice turn, but without fixing that structural problem, we're not going to see the kinds of the emergence of New Deal programs, for instance, without taking on the private interests at work that are leeching on the state.
So let's go back to the question then of this phrase NGOism, right? How do these structural constraints sort of produce the phenomenon that you guys call NGOism, and how does that spread to the rest of the left?
I could take that. I think so. In the article, we lay out three features of NGOism: that it's technocratic, that it's service-oriented, and that it is focused on the community. And where we get those from are, it's related to the structural constraints that we just talked about. So, given the structural constraints on nonprofits, they are incentivized to come up with modes of solving social problems that systematically avoid taking on the profit motive, right? And this makes sense in the case of a lot of nonprofits in terms of their immediate self-interest. Like if you're running a nonprofit hospital, it doesn't make sense to piss off your funders by engaging in political advocacy that might make them mad for whatever reason. So it makes sense within a certain context, but I think the problem that, and I can return to those three features in a second, but the issue that we're concerned with for the left is that, the genie's escaped the bottle. This mode of solving social problems that avoids taking on the profit motive, it's almost seen as common sense by a lot of people who aren't necessarily even involved in the NGO world. And I think to some extent that's not so surprising. I mean, the last, the current generation of activists, young activists, grew up in a world that was carefully curated by foundations and nonprofits. I mean, they funded the work of college professors, they trained campus advocacy organizations, they wrote our textbooks in school. And so that, activists would come to political spaces and they would want to be, do-goodery and technocratic and avoid debates and focus on the community. I don't think any of that is especially surprising given the generational shift. People who at one point would have joined the Communist Party today are volunteering for nonprofits. And I think that leads to a kind of common sense that's very pernicious within the left.